Hey y'all, it's Sharon and I'm back to share another policing experience with you. If you're new to the channel, I worked for 20 years for a southeastern city in the US, and 11 of those years I was a detective. I was also in the military. I wanted to pick up on the last video, Policing in Fear, part 1. Well, this is part 2. And I wanted to touch on the fact that what I mentioned in the last video about going through training as a police officer, I came with some bias and some prejudice, if you will. And what I realized looking back is all that happened was I was trained with the bias and the prejudice. And yes, they did talk about being objective when considering the facts while you're policing. And I tried to do that to the best of my ability, as most officers. But to be truthful, yeah, my bias and my prejudice sometimes affected how I looked at things. And I picked up some bias and prejudices when I went through the academy, that us versus them. To tell you the truth, honestly, there was a little confusion a little bit in my mind, like who is us and them? And it was always the good guys and the bad guys. And I was part of the good guy team, and everybody else, the criminals, were the bad guys. And when I came out of the academy, I held on to that. They used to say you're full of, excuse the expression, piss and vinegar, so, you know, running and gunning, and we're going to go get these bad guys and make these arrests. And I bought into it wholeheartedly. But then as I got older and got into my career, I noticed that getting the bad guys, 95% of the time we were going to the low income areas. And that us versus them started to lose strength, if you will. Because I always said to myself, we come from them. You know, some of us come from low income areas or poor families. And the bad guys were not only just there, you know, they were in the rich areas also. It might take a little more time to get them, but I started to think more widely, if you will. And when I got out of the academy, like I said, it was us versus them, and everybody was suspect, to include grandma, to include the 8-year-old hanging on the corner with his friends. Everybody was suspect. And so coming out with that perspective, as I got older, like I mentioned, I started to say, okay, how does that leave the community? Does it leave the community in fear, or are they sleeping easy at night? Because me and probably 30 other officers for that day had been in their area arresting folks. And I know it magnified the fear within the community. And for me, I didn't want that. You know, I wanted to be, you know, every officer wants to be a good officer and go out there and get the bad guy and have the community recognize that and be for it and be for you as a police officer. But that's not what we're seeing. That's not what we're seeing. And remember, I mentioned in the last video about how so many times I was on one unit, 6 or 7 of us, looking for an arrest. And then I'd see 3 or 4 other units in the same area looking for that arrest so they can keep their sergeants off of them, so the sergeants don't mess up their off days and mess up their money. I was a part of that too. I didn't want the sergeant messing up my money. So yes, I'm going to go get the body. I'm going to go to where it's the easiest. But then I never reflected back on what does that look like to the community? How does that leave the community feeling? I'm talking about protect and serve, but the community's in fear or in violence because all these officers are sweeping the area, coming in, trying to get a body. So I had to reflect on that, and that's what I meant by policing in fear, because the fear as an officer, I don't want the sergeant to come down on me. I don't want the sergeant to mess with my days off. That messes with the extra money that I'm making. That's the fear I'm talking about within policing. And the fact there's nothing in place to protect the officer in terms of having to report abuses by other officers. And I told my story before. There's nothing in place. The policies that are in place, they can be interpreted 1,000 different ways. and used 1,000 different ways at that time when I was on. And so I think part of the problem that we're seeing now in the community, there are things or practices and policies, I mentioned that before, that need to be undergirded by with accountability. And let me give you an example. In my old agency, we couldn't grieve a transfer. I've talked about this before. But how do I prove, if I can't grieve it, how do I prove that this sergeant is transferring me because I didn't cooperate with a cover-up? How do I prove it? And I mentioned that before. I said that some things, some policies have to be put in place and undergirded with accountability. I wrote up a plan. I just need a seat at the table. More policies like that. I talked about what we saw on TV the other day, and the officer kicks the suspect and all that stuff. There are things in place to actually hinder you or stop you almost from speaking out against corrupt things or abuse that you see, because you're afraid. You don't want anybody messing with your money, and you don't want anybody messing with your housing. And when I say housing, we talk about federal court all the time. I don't want to be in federal court defending myself and trying to keep my house because a fellow officer who's now accused of something corrupt, and now I'm testifying. And I don't want that. We never wanted that. But yeah, I think some practices need to be eradicated, and definitely policies that are undergirded with accountability. And what does that look like? That's what we need to talk about. Accountability. As officers, we're trying to hold criminals accountable. And the police, are we holding ourselves accountable? That's a question we need to ask. I read something, so check this out. It says training. Rules, regulations, and laws are observed mechanically to the point where they become habitual. And once that happens, they're followed with minimal effort to the point where you give no thought or consideration to the people of the place. It looks like the number of arrests in a given area. It looks like 16 traffic tickets in an 8-hour period by one officer at one stop sign. It looks like arrest records. And the reason why I read that, I wrote that and I read that part of it. The 16 tickets in one day, that was me. And one stop sign, 8-hour period, probably 6 hours. In a 6-hour period, I wrote 16 traffic tickets in that small area at that stop sign. Why? Because my sergeant said, Walters, I need you to go to this area right here. People are running the stop sign. So yeah, I want to stop people from running the stop sign. I wrote 16 tickets in 6 hours. I remember 1 or 2 arrests, a couple of tows. And I did not think about the people that live in the area. It's probably most of those people that live in the area. I didn't think about towing cars and how are they going to get to work. I didn't think about how that sterilizes the area. And now, yes, it's a bit much for the individual officer to think about all those things, but I started to think about all those things and consider it. And what we're doing in policing, if we're supposed to protect and serve, why do we leave the community in fear? Why? Yes, there's fear within policing. I'm talking about that now in terms of how we interact with each other, rank and file. But think about the community, and I come from them. But it's just a thought, you guys. If that helped, I hope it helped. Leave a comment. And remember, you don't necessarily have to go through a thing to learn from it. Check out our online store. I created some notebooks because I like to write with pen and paper. I'm sure there are other folks that still like the feel of pen and paper. The links are in the description. They can only be found on Amazon, so I provided the link. And check out our store. All right, talk to you later. Bye-bye.